I heard it all before. Is that all you have in store? Is there really nothing more than just fallacies and faith?
Hello and welcome to another episode of my Theistic Pearls of Wisdom series, where I choose posts and comments theists make on Facebook and respond to them from an atheistic, naturalistic, and obviously my own personal perspective. This one has to be a little bit different because not only is the comment I'm dealing with extremely long, so long in fact that it would take up the length of this video just to read it to you, without me adding anything in form of a response, but it is one that appeared in a German-speaking group, and I would have to translate it to present it to you in a way that makes sense. So I will instead give you the topic of the discussion, in which context this comment was made, and summarize and paraphrase what the poster had to say in defense against the argument from evil, which I prefer to call argument from unnecessary suffering anyway. As you see below, this has been ascribed to the ancient philosopher Epicurus, but I have seen people, especially theists, arguing vehemently that this is not the case. I wonder why they think it is relevant at all who actually came up with it, because the words stand tall completely on their own, even if they were anonymous. On a personal note, I do not like to use this argument, especially because it is limited in scope, since it only addresses a good and caring God, a God that can be labeled omnibenevolent. Any non-personal, for example deistic God or an apathetic or even evil God, is not addressed. And counter to what many try to achieve when they are using this argument, it most definitely does not disprove any God. So at best, it gets the believer to think about and reconsider the God they believe in, and in an attempt to shift the goalpost, give up on some of the attributes they ascribe to the God they proclaim, but it will hardly ever be sufficient to get someone to give up faith in God completely, in my opinion. But let us take a look at the argument itself. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then this God is not omnipotent. Omnipotent means all-powerful, here understood as to be able to do anything that is logically possible to do. I know that is somehow a restriction on how omnipotence is generally understood, but theists like to do this to prevent the funny paradoxes atheists so often like to use. For example, can God create a rock that God itself cannot lift? Or can God make a taco so hot God itself cannot eat it? This particular restriction will become very important later in my discussion of this comment. Is God able but not willing? Then God is malevolent. Means God is itself evil or has an evil will. Is it both able and willing? Then where does evil come from? Is God neither able nor willing? Then why call it God? So, as stated already, the comment was made in response and in context of a discussion about the argument from evil, the argument about unnecessary suffering, as it is presented here. First thing the believer who wrote the comment did is to split suffering up in two groups. Let me shortly explain something before I continue. I will from here on only be talking about suffering, not evil, because evil is a judgment call and assumes an agent behind what is happening. Suffering or unnecessary suffering is, in my opinion, much more neutral. So when I say suffering, I mean evil and unnecessary suffering. So these two groups are 1. Suffering that is caused purposely or incidentally through actions undertaken by human beings. 2. Suffering that is caused through events and actions that are not under the influence of any human being. For example, earthquakes, storms, accidents in general, everything that is affected by nature and caused harm, injury, or death to human beings. But no human can be held responsible for it. Now let us look at the first group and what the believer had to say about this. It should be no surprise that here they presented the usual apologetics of God gave humans free will, and because God respects that free will, God decides not to interfere with the exercise of that free will if that exercise now causes suffering or not. That is quite obviously rubbish. The first and obvious point of attack is the inherent claim of human free will. Where is the evidence that humans have anything worth calling it free will in the first place? I do not accept that premise. And obviously no believer ever has been able to demonstrate that humans have free will and that our actions are not completely physically determined. Second point of attack. Please show specific quotes from the Bible where God imbues humans, where God imbues humanity with free will, and point to passages in which this God does actually respect the free will of individuals. A lot of flailing around will ensue, which gets even worse when I point to several instances where God clearly violates and disrespects the decisions of individuals. Let me name but two of those right here. The Pharaoh in Exodus, whose heart got hardened even though he had freely decided to let the Israelites go, and Jonah, whose will he broke and disrespected by having him swallowed by a fish for 3 days. One could argue that he disrespected the free will of Moses on several occasions, but do we really care? And there are many more such instances in the Bible. So the whole respecting of human free will excuse is a non-starter from the outset. But it gets even worse, because if we now ask the believer if there is free will in heaven, their response will, if they are honest and do not try to avoid responding, be yes, absolutely. And if we ask them if there is suffering in heaven, their response surely will be a forceful no, absolutely not. But that would clearly mean that God can create a place where it respects free will, but where this free will and its free exercise does not lead to suffering. And it still gets worse when we consider that in the garden there was no suffering. What else strikes me weird is that somehow believers always assume and claim that this earth is the garden, is paradise somehow, and that it changed because of the fall. But that, if we read the text, is clearly not the case. God drove Adam and Eve out of the garden and put a cherub with a flaming sword in front of the gate to guard it, so that Adam and Eve could never taste the fruit from the tree of life and become equal to God. Strangely, that is always somehow overlooked. So this earth, or at least the parts where we humans live and suffer, are specifically created by God with the attributes that we encounter, which includes suffering. So I wonder and would ask the theist, please explain to me how God is not responsible for the unnecessary suffering here on earth. If it had the choice to create a place with free will and no suffering in the first place. Suffering is in any scenario always intended by God. There is no way around it. In any case, creating humanity in such a way that the individual freely decides only for what is in the best interest of humanity in general is by far not the same as creating mindless puppets or robots, which is how theists like to portray it all the time. But again, where in the Bible does it say that having puppets or robots is not actually the intention that God had in the creation of humans? Let us now look at the second group. Suffering caused by circumstances outside of human control. As I said before, it is very important for this believer to restrict their God's omnipotence to only be able to do what is logically possible. But actually, they go a lot further in attempting to exculpate their God from the inevitable consequences of its flawed creation and the responsibility for it. The first assumption that this theist makes is that this particular universe, this particular Earth, is the best possible universe, the best possible Earth. Let us just ignore the fact that I could come up with several improvements on this without causing any logical inconsistencies. The believer assumes that if God would change a single setting within this universe, or our planet, like making it solid to eliminate earthquakes which are caused by plate tectonics, that this would have unintentional consequences which God cannot counteract, and it would make life on Earth impossible. And they seriously try to tell us that this falls within the restrictions they put on God's omnipotence of only being able to do what is logically possible. As if anything would logically prevent an omnipotent God to put humans into any environment and have us thrive in spite of it. God could make us breathe methane or not breathe at all, and have a magnetic field around a solid ball of rock with no liquid metal core to produce one, while the temperature on Earth could be a balmy 23 degrees Celsius all over the place, with no areas where humans would die without protection. It is ridiculous to assume that an omnipotent God, even with the restriction of having to work within the dictates of logic, would not be able to create a world without suffering. But let us go back to the question I asked before. Is there suffering in heaven? And let us add the following. Does heaven have to follow the dictates of logic? If God has to follow the dictates of logic, it absolutely follows that heaven, created by God, has to follow the dictates of logic. And that means if we follow the dictates of logic as described by the theist, God cannot create a heaven without suffering. It is really a pitiful excuse that this believer had to come up with, because it makes this God impotent and bound by restrictions like no plate tectonics and earthquakes, no life on planet Earth. As if that doesn't make any sense at all. They basically are castrating this God to make their excuses work. And it can still get worse, because the last excuse is the most despicable anyone can come up with if one actually thinks this through. God uses suffering to teach us lessons. Now we have completely given up on making excuses and attempts to exculpate God from its responsibility. Now God embraces his responsibility and says, I make you suffer to teach you a lesson. He obviously does that several times in the Bible, so it is not really something believers need to invent. But it is a weird attempt to have it both ways, is it not? I am reminded of a meme that you see down below where Jesus talks to a sleeping child and tells it that it is so innocent, but that he will kill it this night so that its parents can learn something through the pain they are suffering. Or imagine, you are saying some bullshit like that to a rape survivor. It is bad enough that there seriously are people who basically say, God works in mysterious ways and everything is in his plan and maybe something good will come of this. But to elevate that to an excuse for the unnecessary suffering in the world and basically tell the victim that they deserve what they got because they needed to learn a lesson, or God wanted to help them somehow by forcing them through this ordeal. Yeah, in heaven all tears will be wiped away. But seriously, what does it take to outweigh pain and suffering felt by the victim? That is cruelty of the highest order. To end the whole ordeal, the believer had to say that without suffering, we would not know what happiness is. And they were seriously attempting to compare God with the parents of a mass murderer, asking if those parents should be held responsible for the crimes of the child, as if that analogy would even apply to God and the argument from evil. It does not. Parents do not purposely have a child that they know will go on a killing spree, and they do not have foreknowledge of what will happen, contrary to God. Last, after we have waded through all this ridiculousness, let me come to the atheistic and naturalistic perspective on suffering. Suffering in general is bad if it is not to relieve or prevent greater suffering, as in injections for anesthetics or inoculations. There is a lot of unnecessary suffering caused by humans to other humans, which I would consider immoral because it is done premeditated and on purpose. One has only to look at the wars that are happening right now on this planet. We as humans and as humanity are guilty of that, if there is now free will or not. We are responsible for our actions because the knowledge of that responsibility has a strong physical effect on our state of mind. The fear of consequences pushes us not to do certain things, even though I hope that for many of us, the care and empathy for other human beings is enough to attempt not to intentionally cause harm and rather take action to reduce unnecessary suffering. About accidents and anything caused by nature that is outside of human control, there is little we can do about, aside from mitigating the effects and reduce the suffering after the event. From a naturalistic perspective, suffering has its place. The prey suffers when they are chased and killed by the predator. Pain is a signal to the body that something is wrong and needs to be taken care of. And yes, suffering can sometimes lead to a greater good, like when we are getting an injection to inoculate us or prevent stronger pain, like at the dentist. Some suffering is a biological necessity. In a world created by a benevolent God, suffering makes no sense, and believers have to, like this one here, stretch believability and logic to breaking point to somehow make excuses for why this God of theirs not only ignores, but allows unnecessary suffering, and, as they sometimes have to admit, purposely causes it. If this God exists, it is fully responsible for this. But luckily, we have no reason to actually believe that such a God exists, because such a God makes no sense, and the world in which we find ourselves makes no sense under a theistic worldview. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Theistic Pearls of Wisdom and will join me again the next time on this channel. Enjoy this life. It is the only chance we get, as far as we can tell. See you soon, and goodbye.
I heard it all before. Is that all you have in store? Is there really nothing more than just fallacies and faith?